Welcome, everybody. No, I'm the one who came here, but thank you for showing up this morning. I can't tell you how pleased and honored I am to have been asked to come here this weekend. I've heard for many years from many friends about what a wonderful place this is, and it's certainly turning out to be the case. You've been most hospitable and welcoming, and I do apologize for this rude insertion into your silence, but I figured you asked for it. You get it. You get it. Anyway, I've certainly been, Venerable and I haven't known each other really all that well over the years, but I'm certainly aware of all the work she's done, both as a scholar and, of course, in putting this amazing abbey together. It's quite a work. I think back on the great lamas of Tibet, the great figures, and all of them had these characteristics whereby it wasn't just that they were scholars and who could debate on the courtyard or produce great works of writing. They also were institution builders, and we know that there wouldn't be a Buddhism or a Buddha Dharma in the historical sense if there hadn't been people in the wake of the Buddha's life. Of course, the Buddha himself did much during his life, but who, following the Buddha's death, kept institutions going, because without the institutions you can't have the transmission of the teaching, at least in a widespread sense. So anyway, I'm in deep admiration of the work you're doing here, and it hardly needs to be said that in gender terms this is a very, very important place. A number of people have observed that one of the major changes that has occurred in Buddhist institutions since it got introduced to the West, and it's not just a Western development, it's happened in Asia to some degree as well, and the cross currents are very interesting historically, but the fact that there is such a living, breathing, wonderful monastic tradition among women, and that in fact full ordination is increasingly, whatever may be said at certain levels in various Buddhist communities, it's happening. And that's how history works. People do things, they happen, and it's sort of deal with it. So anyway, so just all a way of saying, I think that, yeah. Anyway, so I'm all just by way of saying how happy I am to be here, and I'm sure I'll disappoint you in many respects. I can't possibly do everything that I would want to do or you would want me to do this weekend. But let me, before I kind of dive in here, I want to say a little bit about my general plan. I've got 4 sessions and they're roughly 2 hours apiece. And my ideal, and as a teacher, I know that the ideal is not always attained, but my ideal is typically to sort of lecture, if you will, for an hour to maybe an hour and a quarter, open it up at that point for Q&A and discussion, and towards the end of each session have some meditation time, specifically geared towards Mahamudra meditation in the Gelug tradition. The 4 sessions, as I'm planning them, again, it doesn't always work out exactly as one would hope, but my basic plan this morning is to talk historically about Mahamudra. Because I think that Gelug Mahamudra, which is really my focus this weekend, can only really be appreciated against the historical and praxis background of what happened in India and what happened in Tibet before there was a Gelug Mahamudra tradition, or at least before there was a public Gelug Mahamudra tradition. That in itself raises interesting historical questions that I'll touch on this morning. But one needs to know a bit about how the term was used in Indian traditions, and how other Tibetan schools before the Gelug, particularly the Kagyu, obviously, dealt with and understood Mahamudra. But we'll talk as well this morning about the development of Mahamudra within the Gelug, both from the kind of traditional standpoint, the understanding that people in Gelug tradition nowadays, and probably for the last several centuries, have had about how that tradition originated. But also, I figured this is, as someone trained academically, this is something I can perhaps bring that a traditional teacher would not necessarily bring, which is a little bit of historical perspective on what seems likely and perhaps unlikely about some of the stories that we have. So that'll really be the main focus this morning. This afternoon, I want to dive into the text. That is the root verses that the first Panchen Lama wrote down sometime around the year 1600. And to work our way, we'll have to work kind of quickly through them. I don't know whether we can't do justice to them in a single 2-hour session, and if it ends up lapping over into tomorrow morning, so be it. I also want to look at some poems that the first Panchen composed. He was quite the poet, and certainly inspired by Mahamudra at times. A number of his poems begin Namo Mahamudraya, and he was actually quite overtly inspired by the example of Milarepa. He actually has a collection of poems that the title is actually very long and complicated, but it's basically inspired by the example of Milarepa and some of his predecessors in this special hearing transmission, this Nyengyu in the Gelug, were also inspired by Milarepa, and some of his successors in both Tsang and Amda were similarly strongly identified with Milarepa, who of course was a Kagyupa. I'm not sure if he knew it exactly at the time, but ex post facto he became a Kagyupa. Sort of the way the first Dalai Lama became the first Dalai Lama, like 100 years after his death. But so it goes. Anyway, so the basic plan is the second session this afternoon. We'll definitely focus on the practice text, and I'll be referring now and again to the first Panchen's auto commentary on that as well. So the session tomorrow morning, primarily the poetry, I hope, but we'll see. And the fourth session, the last one tomorrow afternoon, I want to focus on those 13 questions that I sent, which seem to have created a little bit of a buzz, I gather. But anyway, so we'll do. And I'm a pretty informal lecturer and pretty informal person in general, and I'm not averse at all to somebody just saying, "Wait a minute, stop." Say more about that, or what about this? That's the way I run my classes at Carleton, and there's no reason to run it differently here. Okay, so that's the general plan. So I want to actually start out by saying a little bit about what I would describe as the appeal of Mahamudra. I've been around like maybe 2 or 3 people in this room. I've been around the Dharma scene for a good long time now, 40 plus years in my case. And one of the interesting observations I've made, particularly being around Tibetan Buddhist communities, is there is a kind of endless fascination among Westerners. I'm really talking about primarily with both Dzogchen and Mahamudra. And I've puzzled about this over the years a little bit. And I'll say that having been around essentially primarily Gelug Dharma centers over the course of pretty much 41 years now. I was part of the group that originally helped Geshe Zopa in Madison found what is now Deer Park. It was originally Ganden Mahayana Center, and it was just his little house on Lake Mendota Drive in Madison. One of the things that I've noted is that among practitioners of Gelug who are Westerners, there has been a steady, not alarming necessarily, but a steady kind of move towards a fascination with and ultimately an embrace of, I would say, particularly Dzogchen, but in some cases Mahamudra as well. And so a shift towards Nyingma and Kagyu. And I've puzzled about this, although I think I understand it just on a personal level, because even as I was in grad school with Geshe Zopa in the 1970s, I kept finding myself writing papers on like the Mahasiddhas of India and Milarepa and people like that. And for me, I think it early on it formed a kind of counterbalance to the heavy scholastic orientation that, let's face it, is one of the great things about the Gelug tradition. But if you're a Westerner and you're not training in a traditional monastic way, it can be a difficult thing. And for Westerners, and again, I think you're all pretty used to this now, but you probably can remember back to when you first began to try to deal with Tibetan ritual and imagery and all these, quote, cultural trappings, as we would be wont to say. And I think that what I saw and what I see other people I know seeing is that traditions or practices like Dzogchen and Mahamudra, on the face of it, if you read Mahamudra literature, of course, it's charismatic, it's very poetic, and above all, it seems to me that it's easily read as short-circuiting, short-cutting, doing an end round a run, pick your metaphor. All the ritualism, all the scholastic debate, all the things that at some points we just want to say, no, I just want to settle into the nature of my mind. And I remember, oh God, I'm already getting, sort of into my anecdotage here, but it was a very interesting moment in Dharamsala in the summer of 1974. And this is symptomatic of what I'm talking about. When the great S.N. Goenka, one of the masters of Vipassana meditation, came and did a course at the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives, and the group doing this 10-day retreat, and of course Goenka was famous for the rigor of his retreat, his insistence that all other practices be dropped while the retreat is going on, and you just focus on this point right below the nose for like 4 days, and then you cannot move while you do this entire sweep of your body for an hour and a half as the beginning of Vipassana. And it was a combination of Ingis, Westerners who were studying at the library, and a fair number of monks from the School of Dialectics. And afterwards, so many of the Westerners I knew, I didn't know the Tibetans particularly, but so many of the Westerners, this is like such a relief that you can do serious meditation without all this rigmarole. Was really that was the, I'm colloquializing it a bit, but that was the sentiment. And I think it's the same kind of thing I'm talking about with the appeal of something like Dzogchen or Mahamudra, or these days everywhere mindfulness meditation, right? Mindfulness-based stress reduction. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. And I think it's this dream of having a meditation practice that is our own, and yet it still has the allure of having come from the East, and it gets us out of the necessity to worry about prostrating to a guru or chanting complicated things in a language we hardly understand. And I think this has been part of it. Now, of course, the reality is very different, and that's part of it. I probably don't need to stress this to all of you who are in fact fairly well invested, deeply invested in a particular tradition of practice, imagery, ritual, and so forth, who are dedicated to your teachers, sincerely take refuge in the three jewels. But the thing that you discover when you study Mahamudra, or Dzogchen for that matter, with teachers in the West, but I'm talking about Tibetan teachers in the West, or if you go over and do this in Asia, or most particularly if you dig into the texts, as I have tried to do over the years, you discover that you simply cannot extricate some formless meditation from all of this. It is so utterly wrapped up in, inextricable from ritual practice, Buddhist views of the world, Buddhist ways of understanding reality, and most profoundly in my observations, it is absolutely inseparable in every case from guru yoga. I have if I've seen a Mahamudra text, Kagyu or Geluk, that doesn't make guru yoga fairly central to it, I can't think of it. So in guru yoga, let's face it, is one of the real stumbling blocks for Westerners who come to the practice of Tibetan Buddhism, especially. But Zen, very similar, right? I mean, the role of the Roshi. Maybe in Theravada might be a little different. I don't know whether you've, in your conversations with your interlocutors, you've found it different. There's certainly respect for teachers, but I don't know if it's ingrained in quite as deep a way. Yeah.
There's a lot of devotion to the teacher.
Yeah.
They don't, they say, oh, other people have too much devotion, you know,
Yeah.
we're stripped down, but.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
They have rituals, they have devotion.
No, that's, I mean, I've spent quite a lot of time in Sri Lanka, and that's been evident to me. But as a rhetorical, or as part of the discourse, it doesn't seem to me as quite as, you know, I mean, the Lamrim Chenmo begins, after all, with proper reliance on the guru, and everything flows from that. So anyway, that's, again, I think I'm preaching to the choir on this point, but I just wanted to make this observation at the outset, that whatever the appeal of Mahamudra, I think that sometimes the reasons people are drawn to Mahamudra or to Dzogchen or sometimes to Zen, and again, if you think, oh, I've got, you read Basho's haiku, you read Hakuin's autobiography, you read koans above all, and you think, oh wow, this is just like this direct access without any kind of intermediary, this idea of immediacy, right? It's what Bernard Faure, a great scholar of Zen, called the rhetoric of immediacy, and it's deceptive. And of course, that's how the Mahasiddhas spoke and wrote and sang, and that's one of the kind of tropes of Mahamudra literature is, oh, this is so easy. You get direct access to the natural mind, and you just have to be natural in order to do this. But being natural turns out to be like the hardest thing in the world. And that's exactly why we have ritual. It's exactly why we provide structures within which people can then do this. So that's by way, that's a kind of a rambling preamble of sorts. So I want to talk a little bit about some historical matters here, and comment first of all that Mahamudra has had, over the course of the history of the term, if you will, if we trace a kind of genealogy of uses of the term Mahamudra, it's amazingly complicated. It's meant everything from a ritual hand gesture, and most of you know that a mudra, most often we think, when we hear that term, we tend to think, oh, what's the Buddha's in the earth-touching mudra, or the Buddha's in the teaching mudra, or the mudra of fearlessness, and so forth. So certainly Mahamudra has meant that, and it may have meant that originally, but from very early on, it is also referred to, among other things, the clear visualization of yourself as the deity, which is simply an aspect of deity yoga, of course. It has meant as well, very clearly in Indian literature anyway, a female consort for sexual yoga practice, what we would call sexual yoga practices. It has referred to a kind of a way of living in the world spontaneously on the basis of a realization of the nature of mind. It's meant specific meditations on the nature of mind. It's referred to the ultimate attainment that lies at the end of a tantric path, the Mahamudra Siddhi, or the attainment, the Mahamudra attainment. It's been synonymous with like a page and a half's worth of important terms for ultimate reality, from emptiness to the co-emergent gnosis of inseparable bliss and voidness, to non-mentation, to Buddha nature, to Dharmakaya. The list goes on and on and on. Literally, you will find texts where, say, Mahamudra is this, and it goes on for half a page. So it's an index of ultimacy. But I think for most of us, if we've heard the term but don't know a whole lot about the tradition, we think, that's the central view and meditative method of the Kagyu school of Tibetan Buddhism. And I think that's the way most people know about it. Most of the literature that's out there on Mahamudra that's in Western languages is a result of scholars delving into the Kagyu sources. And there's no question that the Kagyu has made Mahamudra front and center of everything it has done. And if we were talking a little bit at breakfast after the bell rang, so it was perfectly legit. That if you were going to boil it all down, all these complicated senses, and I'll say a little bit more about some of these shortly, but if you were going to boil down what Mahamudra has, for the most part, meant in most places and times, regardless of tradition, regardless of whether we're talking about India or Tibet, it fundamentally has to do with contemplation of the mind's own nature, or realization of the mind's own nature. When the mind becomes the actual object of meditation, the focus of practice, then you're in, at least you're in the ballpark of Mahamudra. Obviously, there are meditations that have to do with certain aspects of the mind that we would say are not Mahamudra, particularly if they're not dealing with the ultimate nature of mind. And there are practices that do deal with the ultimate nature of mind that are not necessarily Mahamudra. I would say that Dzogchen practices are very much oriented that way, but for reasons we'll certainly get to at some point, either in something I say or probably in Q&A. Dzogchen and Mahamudra are not quite the same. But nevertheless, at the center of all this is the contemplation and realization of the nature of mind, and all that entails. It entails living in the world in a particular way, and practicing the path in a certain manner, and so forth. So that's kind of at the core of it. And I've already commented briefly on the word mudra and how that commonly refers to some kind of a ritual hand gesture in Indian traditions. But it actually, even in India, even going very far back, mudra itself could mean more than just a hand gesture. And a hand gesture, by the way, not just in religious ritual, but of course in dance and drama. If you've attended India, if you've seen Indian dance, you know that mudras are an important part of that. And it's hard to know, just as in the West, Nietzsche talked about how theater and religious ritual kind of originated at the same time and in the same place in ancient Greece. And I think in India it's somewhat similar. Whether the dance drama or the ritual came first is hard to say. So it has meaning outside of just religious settings, but it also sometimes will refer to like a state of yogic awareness that kind of is sealed. I mean, a mudra is a seal. It's a royal imprimatur of some kind. We talk about a wax seal on a letter, or a seal that a king affixes to a proclamation. So this is the most general sense of the term, but it also, in some Hindu tantric settings, some of you might have heard of the 5 M's. These 5, they're all Sanskrit words that begin with the letter ma or M, that are to be consumed or practiced in Gana chakras. Gana chakra is the Sanskrit word for tsok, which tsok really, tsoki korlo in Tibetan means like family circle. If you're putting it a little colloquially. But anyway, one of the 5 M's is mudra, which doesn't refer to a consort actually, though it could in other settings, because there's maituna, which refers to that in these Hindu tantric settings. But mudra is a kind of parched grain that perhaps produces some kind of a fermentation effect that was apparently forbidden to Brahmins, and the Hindu tantrikas like to kind of anything that would upset the Brahmins. They were for it. So mudra was one of those things forbidden to Brahmins that they made sure to consume at their tsogs, their gatherings. The term Mahamudra is much more famous in Buddhism, but it does turn up occasionally in Hindu literature. There is a particular yogic asana called Mahamudra, and fortunately I don't know it, so I won't try to replicate it for you. But it actually has to do, if I recall what I read about this correctly, it has to do, it's like putting your foot kind of hard against your upper thigh, and it's supposed to control sexual urges or something like that. Anyway, so that's Mahamudra is that. You find in some Kashmiri Shaivite traditions, and Kashmir Shaivism, incidentally, particularly if you're interested in something like Dzogchen, is a very, very consonant tradition with Dzogchen, and there may be common historical and cultural origins for all this. But in any case, in Kashmir Shaivism, you get references to kind of this blissful gnosis that a yogi attains, and that's not tremendously different from at least some of the meanings of Mahamudra in Buddhist tantric traditions. Anyway, so you do find scattered references in Hinduism, but it's clearly in the Buddhist context that you find the richest and most interesting sources for usages of the term Mahamudra. So in terms of the Buddhist tradition, the first thing to make really clear is that while Tibetan traditions will insist, and of course the first Panchen Lama insists in his text that there are 2 types of Mahamudra. There is a sutra-based Mahamudra, and there is a mantra or tantra-based Mahamudra. And this is a position that is accepted by the Kargyupas as well. It's rejected by the Sakyapas, and we'll talk about that dispute down the road a little bit. But so in talking about Sutra Mahamudra, and we'll see this in the first Panchen's root text when we get to it, he says that the main sources of sutra-level Mahamudra are the Perfection of Wisdom sutras. So the Heart Sutra would be obviously an example of that. And then people may differ a little bit on which text you focus on, but the teachings of Nagarjuna, Aryadeva, and most likely Chandrakirti, though how you read Chandrakirti is a whole other matter. It can be very tricky. And it's also said sometimes, I've seen in Tibetan texts, and I've heard from Tibetan teachers, a kind of quotation from the famous Samadhi Raja Sutra, the King of Concentration Sutra, another, along with the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, is a very important wisdom sutra from the early Mahayana tradition. And there is supposedly a line in there to the effect that, in effect, I'm paraphrasing here, I don't have the quotation right in front of me, and it would take too long to dig it out, but to the effect that the emptiness is the great seal of all dharmas. So this would seem to be evidence that we have in a Mahayana sutra, the smoking gun, if you will, the evidence that the term Mahamudra was used in its sense of the ultimate nature of things, and maybe even the ultimate nature of the mind, in a very early text. Problem, from the historian's point of view, it just isn't there. I've looked through, and I think others have done this as well. If you look through both the Sanskrit and the Tibetan of the Samadhi Raja Sutra, it doesn't put it quite that way. It doesn't say the great seal. It does talk about emptiness being the seal of all dharmas, right? And of course, there are the famous 4 seals that Buddhists have talked about for a long time as the sort of the sealings of the doctrine, right? Which, you know, go, you all remember them, right? I mean, all compounded phenomena are impermanent, all contaminated states are suffering, all dharmas are empty, and nirvana is peace, right? So, you know, you have that. But again, the term Mahamudra really doesn't turn up in the sutra literature. Doesn't mean that in spirit it's not there, but from the intellectual historian's point of view, it just doesn't occur. So it's in fact to the Buddhist tantras that we have to turn for the beginnings of this. And there's a superb article done by David Gray, who teaches at Santa Clara, that he published in the International Buddhist Studies Journal 2 or 3 years ago, where, I mean, I dug into this a bit myself, but that area and that time period is his specialization, and I hope I've got it on the bibliography. I probably do. Anyway, if you want, it's very, very scholarly, pretty long, but it's sort of the state of the art in terms of understanding the meanings of both mudra and Mahamudra in the Indian setting, especially the Indian Tantric setting. You know, there's a lot of questions about Indian history being at times a bit of a morass to try to work your way through, because there was not a concern with dating, really, for the most part, before the Muslim period. And so we don't always know, when we're trying to trace the history of Buddhism in India, what came first and what came after. And there are techniques you can use, and you can begin to winnow things down, or work things down to plausible speculations, but not much beyond that. But if we assume, and I think many scholars would assume, that what we call the action tantras, the kriya tantras, generally represent an earlier phase of the historical development of Tantra in India. Obviously, you know, I'm stepping outside the traditional view here. I'm not presuming that the Buddha actually taught the Tantras. No, I don't think there's an academic scholar out there who believes, from a historical point of view, that the Buddha taught the Tantras. I was at a transmission and translation conference in Colorado a couple of years ago, and I think it was Don Lopez. Most of you probably are familiar. He publishes a great deal as a fine scholar, but this was a conference that brought together academics, you know, had sort of spent much of their life researching these things historically, and then people who were parts of translation groups, you know, of one, the Padmakara translation group, or other translation groups. And Don, I mean, I think he said this fairly, Don does like to provoke occasionally, but he was not trying to be particularly provocative when he stated in the course of a kind of wrap-up session that, well, you know, most scholars don't think the Buddha taught the Tantras. And there were audible gasps from various parts of the audience. So you can see that there, you know, there at times there is a gap between, you know, the scholars and the practitioners, and that's an absurd and kind of meaningless distinction. Anyway, sorry, that was a slight digression. So I am speaking from the historical point of view. Yeah.
It's one thing to say that there's no evidence that he did, and
Yeah.
another to say that he didn't, because there's no evidence.
Right. No, obviously, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, granted. But you know, historians use the tools at their disposal, and therefore that limits them in various respects. I mean, particularly as somebody who studies Mahamudra from a historical point of view, as well as is interested in it as a practice, I'm acutely aware that I'm trying to write about traditions that in many cases weren't written down, right? Oral tradition poses for the historian genuine problems. You know, I totally take your point and concede it, but with the kinds of tools that historians use, there definitely is no evidence of that. I mean, we have, about the Buddha himself, historians have precious little evidence. And I don't know if you're aware of this book by Christopher Beckwith that just came out recently called Greek Buddha. It's the title of which already, he's not actually arguing that the Buddha was Greek, but he is arguing that he wasn't an Indian, he was a Scythian, and that the earliest Buddhist text we have is not something from the Pali Canon, but a Greek skeptical text by Zeno of Aelia, I believe, who we do know visited Buddhist regions in what's now Afghanistan. These were Greco-Indian areas in the last centuries before the Common Era. So anyway, sorry, that's another small digression. So you think we don't know about Tantra, we don't even know about the Buddha from the historian's point of view. So and I tell my classes this always, and I say, look, this is what historians know and don't know, and here's what matters to Buddhists. If you just have to put that in abeyance for the most part.
How do you do that in terms of your own practice?
That's a hard question to answer. I think in many respects I treat it as if, this might be possible, and I will for ritual and meditative and other purposes treat it like it's the case. I don't know so much about so many things, but I know what works, what seems meaningful, what seems to be an accurate way of talking about the world and being in the world. But that's me. I have many other friends, including scholars, who are, perhaps less agnostic on some of these matters. But that's just it's my nature, I'm afraid. Anyway, what we would call the action tantras are probably where the term first seems to have come up. There's a very famous text called the Manjushri Mula Kalpa, the basic ordinance of Manjushri, which is a vast text that was probably written by, again, from the historian's point of view, multiple people over multiple decades. And in that, interestingly, this is probably the first instance of the term Mahamudra. We're probably talking 7th to 8th century of the Common Era here. It talks about it as being this 5-peaked ritual hand position, which signifies the attainment of all worldly and ultimate aims. It can be a female consort. Even in this, we tend not to think about the action tantras as referring to consorts or to, quote, sexual practices, but if we're going to classify this text in this way, and most Tibetans do, well, there it is. And also, it's described, I'm quoting here, the splendor of all mantras, pure, stainless, the destruction of evil, the attainment of all worldly aims, the achievement of all that is highest, the highest dharma, undeclining, the highest step. So there's already, here you've got, if there were sort of 3 basic usages of Mahamudra that you can trace all through history, that it's a hand gesture, it refers to a consort in advanced tantric practices, and it refers to the ultimate nature of things and the ultimate attainment. It's all right there already. And in certain respects, everything else is a playing out in different directions of these 3 fundamental meanings. We do find an additional and important meaning that comes up in the Yoga Tantras. And again, the Yoga Tantras, as I think most of you know, were very important in the early transmission of Buddhism to Tibet, what the Tibetans call the Ngadar, the period of the 3 great Dharma kings, the period of Shantarakshita, Kamalashila, Padmasambhava, Vairochana, and various other great figures. And the Yoga Tantra, because what often are called the highest yoga tantras, or really more precisely the unexcelled yoga tantras, were not that prominent in India at the time that Buddhism first was transmitted to Tibet from basically 650 to 850. The yoga tantras were in effect the most advanced tantric system at that time, and so that this had an influence. And there you have probably the strongest, there are two important senses that we ought to add to our kind of catalog of meanings of Mahamudra. One, and this is quite common, and I already alluded to this in passing quickly at the beginning, Mahamudra is often described as this, as the proper visualization of yourself as the deity. So again, a kind of essential part of Guru Yoga. Sorry, not of Guru Yoga, of deity yoga. And at the same time, it's in the Yoga Tantras that we first get the elaboration of this scheme that is very, very important in later Tantras as well, and much discussed in Tantric literature in Tibet, of the 4 mudras. These are, and the list can waver and vary a little bit, but at least originally there was a reference to a pledge seal, samaya mudra, a action seal, karma mudra, a dharma seal, dharma mudra, and a great seal, mahamudra. Now, interestingly, in the yoga tantras, mahamudra is not the highest in the scheme. Usually the dharma seal is. Action seal will come, as I suspect most of you know, later on to be a specific term for a tantric consort. Much discussion about that in the highest yoga tantra literature, particularly like the Kala Chakra, Chakra Samvara, and so forth. And this is partly because as time went on and Mahamudra became kind of a topic unto itself and began more and more to refer to a meditation on the nature of reality and that reality itself, it came less and less to have to do with a ritual hand gesture or even a consort. But since there's the consort, the discourse on the consort was still an important part of tantric practice, the term karma mudra or action seal was assigned to that particular sort of person, that particular aspect of tantric practice. Anyway, so those are the two important developments within yoga tantra, but it's really in the highest yoga tantras, and I'll just use that term because it's easy and we all know it. What Tibetans would call the father and mother tantras, right? But what scholars generally call and this reflects some Indian and Tibetan traditions as well. They'll talk more about the Maha-yoga tantras and the Yogini tantras. Maha-yoga tantras are roughly equivalent to father tantras, and the most important of these by far is the Guhya Samaja, which, as you know, is absolutely central in the Geluk tradition to the understanding of Tantra. The Yogini Tantras include most prominently the Hevajra, the Chakra Samvara, and the Kala Chakra. Those are probably the three that are best known. There are of course, many others. And, again, I won't go into a whole lot of detail. I'm looking at the clock here thinking, oh, I'm already in deep trouble. And therefore so are you. We're all in this together. But the Guhya Samaja, for instance, does use the term Mahamudra, but I think I would simply, rather than quoting, summarize and say that it covers the range. It's pretty much the same range that the Manjushri Mula Kalpa did, but it also has all sorts of discussions of the ultimate reality. It doesn't necessarily use the term Mahamudra directly in reference to this, but it's clear from the use of synonyms elsewhere in the text that, when it talks about reality as being beyond meditation, pure in essence, space-like, free from thought or its objects, the way to awakening in which there is no awakening, beyond the aggregates, sense fields, elements, and so forth, one with the lack of self of dharmas, eternally unarisen, and in the nature of emptiness. This is reality, but if Mahamudra has increasingly these connotations of ultimacy, and a meditation on ultimacy, particularly as it relates to the mind, then these are, by transference, synonyms, in effect, of Mahamudra. In the Yogini Tantras, this is really where it becomes most important, I think. And here you have the four mudra scheme that was introduced in the Yoga Tantras being revived, but now Mahamudra is definitely at the top of the hierarchy, and it definitely refers, and quite clearly refers, to ultimate reality, the experience of ultimate reality as being, in effect, the gnosis of the inseparability of bliss and emptiness, to use a very common phrase that turns up in Lama Chupa, for instance, in its own way. In the vast space of non-dual voidness and bliss is the way the visualization of the assembly field begins. So it's all these are woven in with each other. And again, the Hevajra and other tantras give similarly complex lists of different meanings, but more and more, again, this is my theme for the moment anyway, more and more the tendency, it moves, even though all the meanings are there at the beginning, there's a kind of shift from the more concrete to, if you will, the more abstract, and from more conventional, if you will, to more ultimate. So Mahamudra takes on this kind of momentum and this force as a really important term for talking about what the case really is, what reality truly is like. And you see this even more than in the commentarial literature on these tantras, where by the time most of these are written, Mahamudras, it's kind of working its way to the center of Tantric Buddhist discourse in India. And so there will be tendencies in Tantric commentaries that will read back into the Tantras references to Mahamudra that aren't really there from the standpoint, of the historian, limited as the historian is in his or her methodologies. There's an interesting, I do need to pause for a moment to give you a brief quotation from the Vimala Prabha, the Stainless Light. This is the great commentary on the Kalachakra Tantra, credited to a Pandit, and probably a Mahasiddha by the name of Pundarika, means white lotus. And he's talking about Mahamudra, and he says that, they talk, there's, if you've studied Kalachakra a little bit, you'll know that the attainment at the end of the path is the sort of, the Mahamudra, they talk about the attainment really of Buddhahood as being the attainment of the Mahamudra of formed emptiness. It's very hard to render this properly in English. John Newman has done, and Vesna Wallace have done the best work on all of this. Anyway, Pundarika in the Vimala Prabha says that Mahamudra entails, and I'm quoting here, emptiness devoid of differentiated representations and provided with all excellent aspects, the accomplishment of omniscience and so forth. Now we need to pause on this point for a moment, because this is a description saying Mahamudra equals emptiness, but emptiness is, let me repeat it, devoid of differentiated representations. Now that sounds, on the face of it anyway, like it's saying that emptiness is simply the same as non-conceptuality. From the much later standpoint of the Geluk, this is not really a proper way to talk about emptiness. Yes, it's true that the realization of emptiness is non-conceptual, but mere non-conceptuality is something that can be attained through concentration meditation. For later interpreters, this is slightly problematic, or at least requires interpretation, shall we say. And it's provided with all excellent aspects. So in this sense, the emptiness that's being described by Pundarika here is not a non-affirming negation. It's an affirming negation. It suggests that when you've emptied out, probably the awakened mind, of everything conceptual, everything samsaric, still there remains the qualities of a Buddha. This in turn is the seedbed, and this is the Kalachakra literature, remember, of what is called the Zhentong position in Tibetan Buddhist philosophy. And some of you, I think most of you are probably aware that I would argue, the greatest and most interesting of philosophical disputes in the history of Tibetan Buddhism is the Rangtong-Zhentong dispute, because after all, you don't get enlightened unless you understand emptiness directly. And if there is doubt about what emptiness is empty of, then this matters. It's not just, with due respect to the debates that are conducted on the courtyard about this or that point in the Gomang manual versus what might be said at Sarah J. And I don't even, that's not my field. So I'm certainly not mocking it. It's very, very, very important stuff. But this has real consequence, and most of you are probably aware, and again, I know that some of you have studied some with Kargyupa teachers in the past, and perhaps with Nyingma teachers as well. To this day, Rangtong versus Zhentong is a live dispute in Tibetan Buddhism, and it's fought out through interpretations of the texts of Maitreya or the texts of Nagarjuna, and kind of accusations fly this way and that, and it's presumably it matters. Certainly from inside the tradition, it matters. So this is one of the seed beds of all of this, and I think it's fair to say that in general, rhetorically speaking, I'm not saying that there aren't many ways to interpret all this, the Tantras tend towards these rather more positive ways of talking about emptiness. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama, I should say, and if you're not aware of this marvelous book, the Gelug Kagyu tradition of Mahamudra, that basically Alex Berzin put together primarily on the basis of two sets of discourses His Holiness gave in India in the late 70s and early 80s. His Holiness is always His Holiness, as we know, is a great harmonizer. One of the earliest and most interesting essays I read by him was one called "The Union of the New and Old Translation Schools," where he's trying to make sense of Dzogchen over against Gelug ways of understanding emptiness. And similarly, he tries to reconcile Rangtong and Zhentong. Some people would say, "Good luck with that," but he's a profound and learned scholar, and for him, where you find the consonance, the harmony, if you will, is not so much at the level of sutra discourse, but at the tantric level. And he talks about the experiences that occur on the completion stage of highest yoga tantra, as beginning. When you look even at Gelug discourse on that, you can begin to see, this is at least one way in which you could understand Zhentong as making at least provisional sense. Of course, from a Gelug standpoint, that's not the way you describe emptiness, but still, at least in experiential or psychological terms, it makes sense there. So anyway, interesting, as I said, a kind of seed bed. The people who are most responsible for getting Mahamudra sort of out there in public, if you will, are the Mahasiddhas, the great adepts of India. And I think you know the names of many of these. Saraha is the most important for all Mahamudra traditions. He's said to be the fountainhead of Mahamudra on this planet in this era. But of course, there are many other figures who were important along the way, ranging from Shavaripa, this mysterious mountain hermit who was probably a disciple of Saraha. Incidentally, tradition says that Nagarjuna was a student of Saraha as well. And that raises interesting historical questions, needless to say. But let me just pause to take a little sip.
More than 600 years.
Yeah, and Chandrakirti lived 1200, so. Yeah. Yeah, well, if you want to establish, anyway, maybe we can deal with that some other time. But, and then figures that Saraha is pretty elusive historically. Probably did not, as Alex Wayman claimed, live in the 1st or 2nd century. from literary analysis, one would determine that he probably was in the 9th or the 10th century, roughly. And, around that same era or slightly later, you have figures like, all of you certainly know of Tilopa and Naropa, and, the famous stories of how Tilopa put Naropa through 12 great trials so as to be assured of his guru devotion. And one of the teachings, the 12 great teachings he gave was, in fact, Mahamudra. You have the figure of Maitripa later on, who is, I'll say more about him, but a vital figure in all of this. Anyway, it was, it's precise. It was to some degree in their commentaries and treatises, but above all in their songs, that the great adepts, as I said, popularized this, because they sang, it wasn't in Sanskrit, it was in the vernacular language, sort of these, it's like Proto-Bengali or Apabhrangsha. They sang these dohas, a doha is basically a rhyming couplet. It's used not just by Buddhists, but Kabir, one of the great crossover figures in Indian religious history, 15th, 16th century, sang in dohas. Many of the sacred scriptures of the Sikh tradition are in dohas. So it's a common poetic form, and it's very accessible, but it's very aphoristic, but it's also very mysterious. It doesn't necessarily say exactly what it appears to be saying. It, as we like to say, it requires interpretation. It is not a direct teaching. And in fact, when Tibetans themselves talked about, okay, what are the literary sources of Mahamudra? At least in the Tantric field, of course they say, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras and the Nagarjuna and the Samadhi Raja and all that, but when they talk about Tantric texts, they don't even talk quite as much about the Tantras. They quote them, of course. They'll quote the Vajra frequently, probably more frequently than any other Tantra. Hevajra doesn't figure large, really, in Geluk practice. It's the only initiation I ever got in it was from a Sakyapa, where it's vital. But nevertheless, everybody knows the Hevajra, everybody quotes the Hevajra. But really, they talk about, there's 3 different collections of texts that Gelugpas and most Kargyupas will agree are the main sources of Mahamudra. Obviously, there's footnotes and qualifications that a scholar would add to this, but for our purposes, I'll try to keep it simple. So the so-called 7 attainment texts, these are all texts, almost all texts, whose title ends in siddhi, attainment, right? So there's the Guhya siddhi, the secret attainment, which is attributed to Padmavajra, and he talks about Mahamudra is that which is cultivated when one has given up practice with either a physical consort or an imagined consort and has, quote, abandoned multiple concepts. He says it's the perfection of all ornaments, pacification into supreme formlessness, lucid, faultless, stainless, and so forth. The attainment of gnosis by the great king Indrabhuti, the Jnana siddhi, says Mahamudra is pervasive and without characteristics, like the sky, the ultimate, the unsurpassed adamantine gnosis, the all-good, the Dharma body, the mirror-like gnosis, and so forth. So you get, I think you've got a feel for the way in which these texts are talking about Mahamudra. Anyway, there's 7 of them. They're mostly kind of treatises that are rooted in the Mahayoga and Yogini Tantras, or the father and mother Tantras, as we would say in Geluk. So that's one collection of texts, 7, sometimes there's 8 of them, doesn't matter. Then there's the Essential Trilogy, and this is the 3 great Doha collections of Saraha, which are usually go under the name of the king, queen, and people dohas, because he supposedly sang these spontaneously to these 3 different groups in a particular kingdom in which he lived. Now, interestingly, these are classic sources, and yet of the 3 collections, and the king dohas is basically 40 stanzas long, the queen is 80, and the people is 120. And only the Queen Doha briefly mentions the term Mahamudra. It describes it as the abiding state of natural non-duality, the sameness of samsara and nirvana, a consort for tantric practice, and the goal of the tantric path. Those are sort of four meanings that it's given. The King Doha talks about the natural purity of mind in a kind of Buddha nature vein, if you will, but never explicitly uses the term Mahamudra. And the People Dohas, which is by far the best known, by far the most often quoted, it's been translated numerous times. I gave a shot at it in a book I published about 10 years ago. But there's other translations out there as well. People Doha never talks about it. People Doha talks about mind, if you will, with a capital M. It talks about the co-emergent or the innate or the connate. This is a very, very difficult term to translate from Sanskrit. Sahaja. It literally means born together. So innate doesn't quite do it because that means something, well, I mean, it means that it's natural to you, right? John Newman likes to use connate, which is an English word, but he used last summer when Jangse Chögyé Rinpoche was teaching Mahamudra in Madison. John used connate, and everybody kind of, every time he would say it, they would kind of stumble over it. And I think it might be another of these get used to it, because it probably is the most accurate actual translation. But whatever translation you use, and I'm just playing here, it conveys the sense both of what is fundamental and natural to us, which is our luminous, empty mind, but also something that is born together with us, and so in that sense it's natural, but also something in which there is an emergence at one and the same time of things that may seem to be contradictory. So appearance and emptiness, bliss and emptiness, the ordinary and the transcendental. There's a long list of things that are co-emergent. And anyway, it's a very important term in Indian and then in Tibetan traditions as well. And it's utilized a number of times in Saraha's texts. There's actually another collection of texts by Saraha, not in this trilogy, the Body, Speech, and Mind, and then Body, Speech, Mind collections, or treasuries actually. And Laura Breitstein of McGill recently published through Bob Thurman's, AIBS series, a translation of these very, very difficult poems that are all about Mahamudra. Constant references to them. And just to give you, I just pulled a few quotes out of her translation. Mahamudra is unchangeable great bliss, experience like the ocean and space, the sameness of all phenomena. That's a term out of the Samadhi Raja Sutra, incidentally. The nature of fruition, unborn, non-dual, beyond the intellect, nothing other than oneself, the highest union, instantaneous full awakening, just that, one's own mind, and the basis of thought-free ethics. And this, of course, is a problem in certain respects, and we know, of course, that the whole discourse around skillful means in Mahayana, going back as far as the Lotus Sutra, Vimalakirti, the Skillful Means Sutra, the Upaya Kaushalya Sutra, that there is, if you misunderstand the rhetoric of these texts, it is you start a very steep and slippery slope to the destruction of ethics. And so this will be relevant in a couple of minutes when I talk about the importance of what happened with the Kadampas when Atisha got to Tibet and wanted to teach the songs of Saraha. It didn't go quite as he had planned, from the historian's point of view. Anyway, so you have this whole collection of sarahas that deals profoundly with Mahamudra. The last collection of texts that Tibetans see as fundamental to Mahamudra as Indian sources, what are called the 25 works on, my current word for this is inattention, but others have said non-mentation, not putting anything into mind. It's manasikara in Abhidharma is the kind of process of paying attention to something. and being focused on it. And Maitripa wrote a collection of works that are called that have now been called the 25 works on inattention, on not paying attention. And again, it's deliberate in the way that perhaps only the Mahasiddhas can pull it off. It's a kind of playful allusion to the fact that you do need to go beyond conceptuality if you're going to understand the nature of reality. He doesn't talk a great deal about Mahamudra in these texts. Even the most famous of them, the 10 stanzas on reality, which is very brief, doesn't mention Mahamudra at all. In fact, it doesn't mention inattention, amanasikara, at all. But nevertheless, his great commentator, what was his name? Sahajavajra, I believe, does interpret it all as actually being about Mahamudra. Again, the way commentarial traditions can look back on earlier texts, say, oh, it was actually about Mahamudra all the time. So Maitripa composed these various texts, and he composed texts outside this corpus that do deal directly with Mahamudra in various ways. He's got a text on the sequence of the 4 seals, right? Which is this important notion. He says there, Mahamudra lacks an own being, is free from the hindrances of the knowable. It resembles the day sky in the middle of autumn, stainless, and is the basis of everything perfect, and so forth. Eventually he does actually equate Mahamudra and emptiness and this practice of inattention. And Maitripa is important not just for the ideas that he contributed, but even more so perhaps for being the first to at least implicitly suggest that even though it has its origins in the Tantra, Mahamudra can be at least harmonized with teachings in the sutras. I mean, it's lying there in plain sight in so many of the things I've quoted that this is imagery drawing not just from tantras but from sutras, and the tantras from a historical standpoint are deeply beholden to the kind of discourse and rhetoric of the sutras. But it's in Maitripa and some of his commentators that we begin to actually get the suggestion that maybe there is a perfection vehicle or sutra level of Mahamudra practice. Maitripa, incidentally, was perhaps the first, at least so legend tells us, to say that 2 of the really vital sources for something like a sutra level Mahamudra are the King of Concentration, Samadhi Raja Sutra, which I've already mentioned, and the Uttara Tantra, which is, of course, one of the 5 great books of Maitreya and the one that deals most directly with Buddha nature. Again, I talked earlier about how some people say that the term Mahamudra appears in the Samadhi Raja, and it probably doesn't. The Uttara Tantra certainly never mentions the term Mahamudra, but because it has to do with realizing the stainless ultimate nature of mind, it becomes by association, in effect, a Mahamudra text. Last point I want to make about the Indian tradition, and I'll get to the Tibetan momentarily, is that if you kind of if you kind of work through all the kind of relatively complicated things I've been talking about, and you arrive at the 11th century, which is the time of the second great transmission of Buddhism to Tibet, you find this incredibly long list of different meanings that Mahamudra has piled up over the centuries. Again, everything from a hand gesture to the ultimate attainment of Buddhahood and kind of everything in between, with a focus, as I've tried to suggest, on contemplation of and realization of the true nature of mind as empty, whatever that means. But I think you can distill from all of this kind of complication 2 basic senses of the term, or 2 basic meanings of the term. And I call these esoteric Mahamudra and non-dual Mahamudra. And I would say that Esoteric Mahamudra, I'm going to quote from myself here, if you'll pardon me, focuses on the generation of a non-conceptual blissful gnosis of reality, the natural mind, through subtle body practices described in the literature of the Mahayana and of the Mahayoga and Yogini Tantras. Non-dual Mahamudra focuses on attaining a direct and unmediated experience of the natural mind through a sudden transcendence of thought, image, and effort. So, but you have to be really careful not to think that these are mutually exclusive opposites, because in fact, this non-dual kind of spontaneous, immediate practice of Mahamudra that we see so much in the songs of the Mahasiddhas, is thoroughly embedded, in fact, in Tantric practice. And, by the same token, or conversely, what was I going to say? When you look into the Mahayoga and Yogini Tantras, or the Father and Mother Tantras, there's an awful lot of that non-dual, spontaneous rhetoric that's to be found there. So I'm not trying to separate these out as really different, even though Saraha famously says, I think he's talking about the innate or sahaja, he says, in it there is, there's no tantra, there's no mantra, there's no mandalas. And you say, what? I thought he was like a tantric master. And again, remember, this is rhetoric. Remember, these are Mahayana Buddhists. If they can shake you up, they will. So you have to think about what he means by that. So again, these are not mutually exclusive, but I think they're helpful in helping us understand why Tibetans later talked about there being kind of sutra or perfection vehicle Mahamudra and Tantra or mantra types of Mahamudra. Let me stop here for a second and see if there are questions before I dive into Tibet. Yeah?
I was just asking for, can you repeat your definition of esoteric Mahamudra?
The way I put it was that esoteric Mahamudra focuses on the generation of a non-conceptual, blissful gnosis of reality, the natural mind, through subtle body practices described in the literature of the Mahayoga and Yogini Tantras. So basically, it has to do with preceding the completion stage, the generation stage, but then completion stage practices that reveal or give you access to the subtlest level of consciousness, which of course is found at the indestructible drop at the heart chakra, and the attainment of a sort of bliss empty awareness, the clear light stage of the 5 stages of the completion stage of highest yoga tantra. From a Gaelic standpoint, it wouldn't be the same necessarily in Kagyu or Sakya descriptions. So that's highly obviously tantric. The non-dual is I would say covertly tantric. It's not, it's so many people. I remember Steve Byer, who was one of my teachers at Madison, in this wonderful set of translations he did, talking about how you can read the songs of Saraha and you can read Zen stories, and you get the same hit, right? You get the same feeling from them, and yet, of course, if you plug these back into their actual context, it becomes evident that there are many differences, at least in those contexts, and you have to be careful about too easily saying, sort of anybody who utters a spontaneous and rather playful denunciation of conceptual mind anywhere is talking about the same thing. It's not always the case. Any other questions for the moment? Okay. Ooh, I'm way behind. Sorry, you get me going. As I said, you asked for it. Anyway, so to Tibet, finally. We're not quite to the Gaelic yet, but and I don't know how much meditation we're going to do in this session. Well, we'll at least do 5 minutes of it at the end to get a taste.
We're not bound to 11 o'clock. We don't turn into doctors.
Oh, good. Well, if you all did, I would want to as well, but it's right. It's like the famous story of king, all of whose subjects had drunk this water that made them mad. And you know, he realized he couldn't communicate with them unless he drank it as well. So anyway, it's an old Buddhist story, or maybe an old Indian story. Anyway, so for the purposes of understanding the history of Mahamudra, it's the second transmission of Buddhism to Tibet that's most vital, because it was during this, you know, there's a kind of this dark period, right, after the reign of Langdharma and his assassination by the heroic bodhisattva monk Pelki Dorje, and then the kind of collapse of the Tibetan Empire, which had been a real force in Central Asian life and politics for 2 centuries, from Songtsen Gampo up through Rinpoche, really. Then there's this dark period where the Vinaya kind of collapses in central Tibet. It's only to be found kind of in the borderlands, especially in the east. And then eventually, you know, with the help of great figures like Yeshe and Zhangzhu, these kings of Gugay in western Tibet, and the efforts of people in central Tibet, this commerce of people and ideas and practices, which have been going on all along, but really resumes, and there's an attempt to kind of reinstitutionalize Buddhism, because Buddhism had collapsed institutionally in central Tibet along with the empire. But you know, the sort of symptomatic figure here is Atisha, of course, and I will talk about him momentarily. But what you see during the you know, even as early as the late 10th century, but especially in the 11th century and the 12th century, is this acceleration of movement of Tibetans to India, Indians to Tibet, resumption of the translation projects. In fact, a kind of a whole new start on the translation projects that had begun in the early period. And one of the most notable changes in Indian Buddhism between the first transmission and the second transmission was that the Mahayoga, and especially the Yogini Tantras, had become central to Buddhist life in northern India. And because that was the case, and because, as we've seen, Mahamudra was central to especially the Yogini Tantras, Mahamudra suddenly became a hot topic among Tibetans. And so you know, there were transmissions by various disciples of Maitripa, Vajrapani being the most famous, and then students of Vajrapani, not the deity Vajrapani in this case, simply a man by the name of Vajrapani. Padampa Sangye, who's a great figure from South India. I'll mention him very briefly in a moment. Marpa, Drokmi Lotsawa, the great translator Drokmi, you know, these Tibetan figures who went to India, got these teachings, got these transmissions, and these teachings and transmissions were fundamentally Yogini Tantras. Mahayoga Tantras like Guhya Samaja, yes, of course, as well. So Mahamudra kind of comes to the center of Tibetan intellectual and practical religious life at this time. And what you find is that in the various schools that developed in what Ron Davidson has felicitously called the Tibetan Renaissance, he's got a book by that name, which is mostly about, yeah, it doesn't matter, anyway, a very, very good history of this era. Because Mahamudra was so important in these Indian traditions, Tibetans simply couldn't ignore it. And so every school, whether or not they made Mahamudra absolutely central to what they did, well, that was up for debate, but everybody had to deal with it. So even the Nyingma, which of course traces itself back to the first dissemination of the teachings in Tibet, and relies to a great extent on treasure texts, terma, that were supposedly planted by Padmasambhava either in the earth, sater, or in the minds of disciples, or which, you know, might then be discovered by an incarnation several generations down the road. Anyway, Nyingma, as I think you all know, I mean, it means the old tradition, and this has a dual sense of looking back to the olden history of Buddhism in Tibet, but it also refers specifically to the fact that the Nyingmapas often rely on the old translations, the ones that were done in that early period, and in particular to a whole set of tantras that are not actually accepted by most of the other schools. So there's Nyingmapas recognized the basic, the Kangyur and Tengyur as it was later edited, but they've got appended to that what's called the Nyingma Gyubum, the kind of collection of Nyingma Tantras. And these are texts that Sakyapas, Kargyupas, Gelugpas don't really pay attention to, but they're really central to Dzogchen and other Nyingma practices. But my point actually is not to get into that too much, but simply to note that there is a certain kind of consonance, again, to use the term I seem to be using a lot this morning. There's a kind of consonance between Dzogchen and Mahamudra, because so much of the imagery of non-duality, non-conceptuality, spontaneity, and so forth is found there. But Nyingmapas will actually use the term Mahamudra in various contexts, even in their early texts. But usually, if you know the 9 yana scheme of the Nyingmas, the highest is Ati Yoga, which is basically equivalent to Dzogchen. Dzogchen then is subdivided in many ways. And that one step below that is Anu Yoga, which may be a shorthand for Anuttara, and does refer in any case more or less to the practices of the Yogini Tantras. And because Mahamudra was central to the Yogini Tantras, this is where, above all, you find Dzogchenpas or Nyingmapas talking about Mahamudra. And it's respected as a profound realization, but it's a step below Dzogchen, clearly. So it's not, even if in many other contexts Mahamudra is the highest attainment, here it's just a shade below. I'll talk about syncretism in a bit, but the Kadam then, which is, there's a historical point that probably I should just mention briefly, that the Nyingma looks back to the early period of the transmission of Buddhism in Tibet, but it, as a kind of self-conscious school, it really dates to the second transmission. Because it was in the face of all these new developments that the Nyingma kind of said, oh, okay, this is who we are. We are not this, we are not that. Kind of the way Shinto in Japan was never really a self-conscious tradition until the Buddhists came along and in effect held up this mirror, which is actually an image from Shinto, but never mind that for the moment. And the people who became Shinto said, oh, okay, they do this, we do this, this is who we are. So that's just something about Nyingma. The Kadam is, of course, best known to Gelugpas as the inspirational source for the Lam Rim and for the Lojong teachings and so forth. Tsongkhapa, I think, quite self-consciously thought of himself as a kind of neo-Kadam, as resuscitating this tradition that had these great geshes in the original sense of the term, not in the kind of technical sense that Gelugpas now use for that. These great geshes who had left us this marvelous literature, these different transmissions, Lam Rim transmissions, and textual transmissions and realization transmissions and so forth. But, it's seen by Gelugpas as above all being the source of the Lam Rim. And the Kadam is often depicted as being, and Atisha as the inspirer of the Kadam, as being a fairly conservative school. In fact, Atisha had not only did he travel all the way to, Sumatra to get a particular type of bodhicitta teaching, Suvarnadvipa, the Golden Isle, but he had studied perhaps with Maitripa in India, certainly knew the Tantras backwards and forwards the way everybody in India did it at those times. And when he arrived in Tibet, of course, it's well known that he was to some degree horrified by some of the abuses of Tantra to be found there, as Kings Yeshayö and Jangjubche, who had sponsored him, they were similarly horrified, and he did, through the Kadam, restore this sense of asceticism and morality and the importance of vows and so forth, even though many of the Kadam geshes were not themselves actually fully ordained monks. They were wandering yogis in the way that, say, Milarepa or Marpa. Well, Marpa was actually he was a fixed yogi. He had a place. Milarepa wandered. But this is the reputation of the Kadam, and it's said by Gulotsawa in the Blue Annals, this great history of Tibet written in 1478, that when Atisha arrived in Tibet, he was anxious to promulgate the songs of Saraha, and his Tibetan disciple, Drom Tunpa, who really founded the Kadam as a kind of institution, said, don't teach these, people are going to misunderstand. So precisely that point about, sort of realization that's free from morality, that kind of what we would call antinomian or countercultural rhetoric. He just thought, we're trying to get over this period in which people have abused all this, so please don't teach this. Well, it's said that Atisha did not then teach Saraha's songs publicly, but he sort of handed off special teachings to special disciples, and that there was a kind of secret transmission that went down through the Kadam. And if you look actually even at some of Atisha's Madhyamaka texts, it's very clear that he's using language similar to that used by Maitripa, used by other people in talking about the pure, luminous, empty nature of mind and so forth. So people often they might not use the term Mahamudra, but they would smuggle in the rhetoric of Mahamudra and some of the practices of Mahamudra just under a different title. You have as well some kind of minor lineages, that so-called minor lineages, because they didn't develop into major orders, that for which Mahamudra was quite important. You have the Jije, or pacification tradition of Padampa Sangye, which is actually, it takes its inspiration from the line we recited this morning from the Heart Sutra. It's the pacification of all suffering. Dungel Tamchegi Jije. And this was not only did Padampa Sangye promulgate and bring to Tibet many of the songs of the great adepts, but he also developed his own styles of Mahamudra practice, some of them more esoteric, some of them more non-dual, to use my perhaps questionable terminology. And the whole tradition of Che, which all of you certainly have heard of Che, most famous, of course, for this practice in which you visualize giving your body up to demons for consumption, as a way, of course, of severing, and that's what Che means, severing your attachment to self. This was, of course, developed in Tibet by, some would argue, the greatest of all Tibetan yoginis, namely Machik Lapdunma. And she was either a direct or indirect disciple of Padampa Sangye, so Shije and Che tend to be associated with each other. And all of what she taught, not just that particular visualization practice, but other kinds of practice, went under the sort of broad name of Mahamudra Che. So it was seen as very much that way. And you have this tradition as well. It's now been absorbed more or less into mainstream Kagyu, but at the beginning it was separate, called the Shangpa Kagyu, which interestingly has Tsongkhapa studied with some Shangpa teachers, and Tsongkhapa shows up in contemporary Shangpa lineage prayers on occasion. Anyway, the Shangpa trace themselves back to a figure by the name of Kyungpo Neljor, who again traveled to India like so many of these founding figures. He studied with the great Indian yogini Niguma, there's an excellent book out on Niguma by Sarah Harding. Niguma was said to be either the sister or more often the consort of Naropa. She herself taught 6 yogas, the way, of course, Naropa famously taught 6 yogas, and also gave him a particular Mahamudra practice called the amulet box Mahamudra. And if you think about a Tibetan amulet box, which is often worn around the neck, and it kind of is sectioned so that you pull it apart and it has within it a text or a practice manual or something. And this was symbolic of the way in which, appearance and emptiness or bliss and emptiness would be conjoined in the actual experience of Mahamudra. And you had then the Sakyapas as well, who rejected the idea that there was any kind of Mahamudra that wasn't tantric. And so when they use the term, and they do use it, it's always a practice or an experience that follows on tantric initiation or empowerment. At the same time, you know, the kind of great Sakyapa practice traditions, the Lamdre or fruit in its path, and specific teachings within that, like the inseparability of samsara and nirvana, the three visions and so forth, these are all, you know, particular practice traditions within Sakya. If you actually look at the meditation practices, they're very similar to Mahamudra types of practice, just as those Kadam Madhyamaka practices turn out to look a lot like Mahamudra. But it's in the Marpa Kargyu, that is the branch, the large branch of Kargyu that was founded by Marpa Lotsawa, 1012 to 1097, if you're keeping track of dates, that we really have Mahamudra brought front and center in a given tradition, such that from the time of Marpa on, but certainly from the time of Gampopa on, and more about Gampopa in a moment, the whole Kagyu sense of what the proper view is hinges on the term Mahamudra and various meanings that may have. And by the same token, the central practice for Kagyupas is the practice of Mahamudra. Now that Kagyupas in the course of time, maybe not at the beginning, come to separate that out into what they call a path of means and a path of liberation, taplam and a drolam. And the path of means basically is the practice typically of the 6 yogas of Naropa. And so it's what I'm calling esoteric Mahamudra, explicitly and obviously tantric. And the 6 yogas of Naropa, if you study those a little bit, you know that they primarily, though not exclusively, relate to what we would call completion stage practices. The completion stage is not, incidentally, understood in the same way in all Tibetan traditions, but I can perhaps get back to that at another point if people are interested. Anyway, so you have the path of means, which is explicitly tantric and I would say esoteric, and then there's the path of liberation, which is what we more typically think of as Mahamudra meditation. That is this meditation on and realization of the nature of mind. And those two are and that's what I'm calling non-dual Mahamudra, because it at least doesn't explicitly deal so much with those tantric settings, even though it's obviously in the background. So Marpa and Milarepa both talked about Mahamudra in these various senses, and I could go on, and I love quoting poetry, but I won't quote from Milarepa right now, and move on to Gampopa, because Gampopa Sonam Rinchen, who is the founder of the tradition that you might roughly call that we typically call the Dakpo Kargyu. Don't worry about it, okay? There's the Kagyu are divided. It's almost like Protestantism in the West. There's so many divisions within it. But Gampopa was the figure who, more than anybody else, was responsible for institutionalizing the Kagyu and also for monasticizing it, because the famous saying about Gampopa, this originates in Kagyu circles themselves, but everybody else quotes it as well, is that in Gampopa, the two streams or the two rivers of Kadam, and really what this means is Lam Rim, and the stream of Mahamudra came together, because Gampopa had been a Kadam monk before he ever met Milarepa, who was, of course, his most important teacher, ultimately. And again, he established a kind of monastic tradition within the Kagyu that is maintained to this day. And he established kind of lasting institutions, and he kind of brought together Mahamudra meditations and theories that he had learned from Milarepa with the Kadam stages of the path. It was actually called the stages of the doctrine in those days, the Ten Rim and not the Lam Rim. But that, again, that's a petty point for the moment. And if you've ever read in one of the 2 good translations out in English, his famous Jewel Ornament of Liberation, you there have a text that does precisely that. Mostly it's a Lam Rim text, but when you get to his discussion of the perfection of wisdom, suddenly he's quoting Saraha and Shavaripa and talking and using the rhetoric, if you will, of the perfection of Mahamudra traditions. And he was all about Mahamudra. He contributed so much to the discourse on this that it's hard to know where to begin. He talked about Mahamudra as being a gradual path in some cases. He talked about, for instance, the fivefold Mahamudra, which it consists of bodhicitta and guru yoga and deity yoga, meditation on emptiness and dedication, and it's something that sort of any Gelugpa would say, oh yeah, I recognize that as a graded path. And he also, there was one called, joining the co-emergent. Again, hard to translate that really, but again, this was a kind of Mahamudra technique that involved, definite stages of shamatha and then vipassana. But he also talked about instantaneous types of Mahamudra. The more, there was one called the thunder strike, and you don't even really need to comment on that. It's like wham, got it, Back in the 60s, I used to read Zap comics, and there was this great sequence. There was this Mr. Natural figure. Some of you may recall this, and there was this one episode where people were kind of walking down the street, and suddenly, a meatball would hit them in the head, and they would have this spiritual realization. I'm not playing. I'm not trying to be disrespectful in the slightest. But this notion, you've got this thunder strike of realization, and an even better known one called the white panacea, the single realization, the realization of the nature of mind that takes care of everything. A panacea is a medicinal herb or concoction that takes care of everything, and so Mahamudra was supposed to be that, and it was instantaneous and so forth. He talked about the 4 yogas, and these are very, very important in Kagyu Mahamudra: single-pointedness and non-elaboration, single taste, and then what's called non-meditation. And this is a kind of a sequence that one moves through. He talked about Mahamudra as being the same as ordinary mind. That is the true nature of ordinary mind. He talked, and this is perhaps most vital, he talked about a Mahamudra that definitely was outside the Tantras. If Marpa and Milarepa and others had kind of equivocated on it, and if the Sakyapis had said, no way, there is no such thing as a perfection level, sutra level Mahamudra, Gampopa, he may never have actually used that term, but it was very clear that he would give a kind of special pointing out instruction to certain disciples who had not received tantric initiation. And he seemed to favor this as a way of kind of popularizing Mahamudra. So much of what we see in the rest of Kagyu history, in terms of both doctrine and practice, can be traced back to Gampopa. And there's a fantastic book, very, very scholarly, heavily footnoted, about Gampopa and his Mahamudra teachings that's just come out within the last few months from Tim Krag, Ulrich Timme Krag, is he German? Probably German. Came out in this series that's published out of Tokyo, and I'm pretty sure I've got it on the bibliography there, but it's by far the best scholarly work that's been done on Gampopa, and shows the breadth and depth of his importance for the tradition. I'm really conscious of time here, and I think I'm actually not going to get to the Gelugpas in this session, but because I think if I simply declare that, then I've got a little more room here. I want to make just a few more points here. There's from Gampopa originate all these different sub-schools and then sub-schools of the Kagyu, some of which faded away with time, others of which have remained vital to this day. I would say that the 3 most important of them are the Drigung, the Drukpa, and of course the Karma. The Karma Kagyu is today, and has been for a long time, the most powerful of these schools, and one might argue the most creative and the most interesting. And I'm not going to say a whole lot about the Tselpa, about the the Drigung or the Drukpa. I will say that all these schools put Mahamudra front and center because that was the Kagyu way. They had different emphases. And so there's a sub-school called the Tselpa, didn't last long, but had a vital, dynamic, politically active, and very controversial figure by the name of Zhang Rinpoche, who taught this white panacea of Gampopas, and taught it vigorously and very eloquently. He has a long poem that kind of talks about the theory and practice of the white simple, and basically says, well, gradualism is okay. The Buddha taught it for those of lesser abilities, but the simultaneous, the immediate way is the best way. And this would become quite controversial in time, as he himself was controversial, again, more for his worldly activities, which when Tibetan historians deal with him, they say, we think this was skillful means. He had armies. Anyway, the Drigung focused primarily on this fivefold, more gradual Mahamudra, and that this becomes important. The Karma Kagyu focused on a whole different range of practices, but the joining with a co-emergent was one of them that garnered particular attention. The songs of Saraha were widely read and commented on. And one of the Karmapas, the third, was a vital figure in many subsequent discussions. But I need to pause before going on to the third Karmapa to say a little bit about Sakyapandita, because it was Sakyapandita who in the well, his dates are 1182 to 1251, so this would probably be early in the 13th century, wrote a famous text, it's been translated into English by Jared Roten, called Clear Ascertainment of the Three Vows. And this is, of course, talking about the Pratimoksha vows, Bodhisattva vows, and Vajrayana vows. And he uses the occasion of discussing the three vows to launch attacks on various opponents in the Tibetan religious world. And most prominent among these are Kargyupas. And most prominent among Kagyu teachings is Mahamudra. And what Sakyapandita says, he makes two major claims. One is a historical claim, and the other is a kind of doctrinal claim, or a complex of doctrinal claims. The historical claim is that actually Mahamudra is not originally an Indian teaching, that it originally is a Chinese teaching. It is in fact the teaching of Hashang Mahayana. Okay, I need say no more about that. That had been appropriated by Tibetans and given this veneer of Indian legitimacy, because we know that all legitimacy comes from India and not particularly from China, and that therefore it was the Hashang view and practice in disguise, and therefore deadly to the proper practice of Dharma. So he makes this historical argument. And he makes in particular a series of kind of doctrinal arguments. He says that, to argue that a single practice, right, the panacea, will get you all results is absurd, because even though, of course, the realization of emptiness, the gaining of wisdom is crucial, you have to conjoin that with method side practices, or you don't get the two bodies of the Buddha, right? The two accumulations, the two collections are absolutely necessary. And from his standpoint, this is just about wisdom and nothing else. No method, no bodhicitta, nothing like that. He also saw Gampopa and others as claiming that you could realize emptiness strictly through non-conceptual meditation. And again, that comes back to a point I made earlier, that of course non-conceptuality is part of a direct realization of emptiness, and a Buddha's mind is non-conceptual, at least in any sense of our understanding of that term. But not all non-conceptual meditation is meditation on emptiness, and he saw this as kind of one of these concentration meditation dead ends. Again, like Hashang, blanking your mind. Just drop concepts and that's it. So he saw that as a problem. And then he argued vociferously, as I think was already the tendency among Sakyapas, that you simply couldn't say there was any kind of Mahamudra outside the Vajrayana. It's strictly a tantric practice and realization rooted in your proper initiation, reception of the 4 initiations that are specific to pretty much mother and father tantras. So this became, he threw down a gauntlet that nobody could avoid picking up in subsequent decades. And so Kargyupas, generation after generation, sort of fight back against Sakyapandita. Gelugpas talked about this as well. It was an important and interesting critique that Sakyapandita launched. I would say that it was largely ignored. It didn't do anything to stunt the growth and creativity of Mahamudra traditions in the Kagyu, which continued apace and over the course of the next 4 or 5 centuries reached incredible levels of both religious creativity, poetic eloquence, and systematic scholastic elucidation. All of these things happened, and I'm not going to spend much time on any of that, only to say that, again, the 3rd Karmapa is a crucial figure in all of this. The 3rd Karmapa, Rangjung Dorje, let's see, what would his dates be? 1283 to 1339, something like that. Anyway, just branching over those 2 centuries there. And he was arguably the first Karmapa to know he was a Karmapa. Again, the others got it by association as earlier incarnations. And this is where it's side note, right? It's most of you are aware, I think, that the tulku system as we know it originated with the Karmapas in this era, sort of 2nd Karmapa to 3rd Karmapa, so 12th, 13th to 14th centuries roughly. And the 3rd Karmapa was one of the most eloquent and most self-conscious about this whole thing. And he puts together, he's incredibly learned in Indian and Tibetan traditions. He fuses together in amazing ways, Madhyamaka, Yogacara, Buddha nature discourse, Tantric discourse from India and Tibet into some kind of amazing synthetic system. He writes one of the first really systematic meditation manuals, a meditation manual where you can sit down and say, it'll tell you, okay, visualize your guru. Guru comes to your crown of your head, melts into you. Now you go into shamatha. Okay, now you're in shamatha. Now you go into vipassana. Now you see things. Now you arise from meditation. You see it all as an illusion, and you dedicate the merit. That's a handy-dandy and rather abbreviated version of what all this is about. But he's one of the first to lay it out in this clear and systematic way. And really, some of his, there's this fantastic translation by Peter Allen Roberts. I notice you've got it in the library here. There's a hardcover. It's Mahamudra and Related Instructions. It's in Thupten Jinpa's series from Montreal. But there's also a paperback now that distilled out of that just the Mahamudra teachings. And I'm fairly sure that one of these is included in there. He also had a very important text that became part of the liturgy in Kagyu. It's the song or prayer of Mahamudra, the Chagchen Munlam, where he talks, among other things, about the kind of intersection among Dzogchen, he uses that term, and Chagchen, Mahamudra, and what he calls Mahamadhyamaka, or Uma Chenpo, the great Madhyamaka. And he definitely had tendencies that we might call syncretic. He was interested in Dzogchen, just as his predecessor, the 2nd Karmapa, had been interested in Dzogchen. And he also, it would seem, has within his writings, if not in an explicit way, the seeds of the Zhentong view. When he talks about emptiness, he tends to talk about it more in terms of kind of the luminosity of mind that's what's left after you've negated other things. And he may or may not have actually been a teacher of the great Dulpopa Sherab Gyaltsen, who founded the to Gelugpa's infamous Jonang school. This is a school that actually has been, it never went away, but it kind of has reappeared in recent years. And there's been Jeffrey Hopkins, in fact, has translated this immense text, Mountain Doctrine, and you've got it in the library, by Dolpopa, which lays out the Zhentong position. And it may have been influenced, he was influenced largely probably through readings of Buddha nature, scriptures and treatises, and some kind of understanding of Kalachakra, but the third Karmapa may have influenced him as well. There's some sources that suggest they met and that he might have been a disciple of the third Karmapa. Anyway, he lays out this Zhentong view in a potent and very uncompromising way, and this will become the object of critique. Again, this is one of the disputes. The last session, we'll get back to some of this a little bit, but many people, certainly the Gelugpas who came along a generation or two after Dolpopa, Tsongkhapa's not that far removed in time from him, and other later Gelugpas, but also other Kargyupas and Nyingmapas who the Gelugpas are totally unsympathetic to the Zhentong position, except, as I suggested, in the ways that His Holiness tries to find some reconciliation, perhaps at the indestructible drop in the heart. But Kargyupas and Nyingmapas who are interested in this and who are prone to think in these ways, to think, for instance, of emptiness as an affirming rather than a non-affirming negation, they were also critical of Dolpopa because he was so uncompromising in his taking literally language in the Buddha nature literature to the effect that, say, Buddha mind is permanent. Already, you're kind of wobbling, permanent, pure, peaceful, and so forth. And he would be criticized by many for starting down this slippery slope into Hinduism. And in fact, Tuken Chukyi Nyima, in his great text on the different Tibetan tenet systems, which would be a fun thing to do. Be fun to do a course on that sometime. I was editor of Geshe Zopa's translation of that some years back. Anyway, Tuken, he's a very kind of as Gelugpas go, he was quite non-sectarian, ecumenical, I would say, and he defends the terma of the Nyingma and saying these are legitimate. He says that the great figures like Marpan Milarepa really understood things. He's great respect for the Sakya scholasticism. Even if they slip a little towards Yogacara now and then, still they're great. When it comes to, I wish I could remember the exact image he uses for the Jonang, for Dolpopa's tradition. He has this wonderful poetic, poetic verses at the very end. It's something like a garland of this is probably wrong, but it'll give you the spirit of it. He says that the Jonang tradition is like a garland of marigolds that's intermixed with thorns and in effect barbed wire, because Tsongkhapa himself received from his Jonang teachers, and we know that Tsongkhapa studied with everybody. He got from his Jonang teachers Kalachakra transmission, so it was very important in that respect. But this Zhentong view, that's the barbed wire, that's the thorns that you have to get beyond. Anyway, last couple of points here. So that was just a little aside on this other emptiness or Zhentong view. And the last point, I'm going to make two last points here. One is that the kind of I've talked about the different ways of the many different ways in which Kargyupas tended to talk about Mahamudra and how it differed a little bit from school to school. In the 16th century in particular, I'm just going to jump down to there, skipping some important figures. You have this great scholastic efflorescence where people begin writing these immense compendious works on Mahamudra. You know, a little bit the way Tsongkhapa wrote the Lamrim Chenmo or the Ngakrim Chenmo to give us the stages of the Sutra path and the stages of the Tantra path, and quote copiously from this incredible range of scripture with which he was familiar. We see this in Mahamudra literature among the Kagyu in the 16th century especially, and you know, you have philosophical developments that go beyond anything that had been seen before, and therefore you have figures like Dakpo Tashi Namgyal, who wrote the famous Moonbeams of Mahamudra. This was one of the first big Mahamudra texts translated into a Western language. Lobsang La Lungpa translated it in the mid-'80s, I want to say, and it was revised a little bit. Wisdom has it out now. I think it's Quintessence of Mind and Meditation or something like that. And and this is an immense Mahamudra manual that goes, and you know, again, it talks about the Tantra traditions, it talks about the Sutra traditions, it talks sometimes about Mahamudra as being completely beyond either Sutra or Tantra. You know, in the little way, this ways you always have to do a little one-upsmanship, right? And anyway, this is an amazing and worthwhile book to study for probably the most influential of all Kagyu summaries and treatments of Mahamudra. You have figures like the 7th, 8th, and 9th Karmapas. The 7th Karmapa put together an anthology of Indian Mahamudra texts, which is mostly, it's not tantras per se, it's mostly songs of the Siddhas, treatises by people like Maitripa and Tilopa and Naropa and Saraha and so forth, all the great lineage figures. He also talked about the ways in which Buddhist logic could be connected to Mahamudra. Very interesting discussions of, for instance, this idea of self-cognizing cognition, svasamvedana, rangrik, which actually, if you study some with both either Kargyupas or Nyingmapas, rangrik has both this very strict epistemological sense of a mind that cognizes each moment of mind, but it also has the sense of being something more fundamental, our self-awareness, that it then becomes synonymous at least with a notion like Rikpa, which in Dzogchen is the kind of fundamental awareness that is behind everything. Anyway, the 7th Karmapa talks some about this. The 8th Karmapa wrote a whole range of different texts on Mahamudra and did great commentaries on Indian Shastras that became the basis for argumentation with the Gelugpas, and then rebuttals from the Gelugpas. And Mahamudra kind of, for him, was Madhyamaka and vice versa. So interesting in that respect. The 9th Karmapa wrote 3 great Mahamudra texts, one of which, the Ocean of Definitive Meaning, is probably as long as Tashi Namgyal's great text. And it's been translated into English, but it's only available to people who have certain kinds of transmission, who have received so-called pointing out instructions from a Kagyu or Nyingma teacher. These days, Kagyu and Nyingma, it's both, it sort of works, they work in conjunction with each other. Anyway, just this whole scholastic efflorescence. And the last thing to mention perhaps is that we've already seen this a little bit in my comments on the 3rd Karmapa and his interest in Dzogchen. In later periods, you find an increasing tendency towards what you almost might call a syncretism or synthesis of Dzogchen and Mahamudra. And the most famous figure who contributed to this is a teacher by the name of Karma Chakme, who lived during the 17th century. So he was just a little bit after this great scholastic era. And he kind of sets Mahamudra and Dzogchen in some kind of close relation to one another. And this would become a model for teachings and texts that would appear subsequently that tried to show the kind of unity of these two very fundamental ways of contemplating and realizing the nature of the mind. And it's that, I'm going to kind of leave it at that point by saying that there is an interesting question, and I'll address this at the beginning of the afternoon session before we move on to the actual text, when I talk a little bit about the tradition. But one of the most interesting questions that is debated currently about the Geluk Mahamudra tradition is whether it is strictly a Geluk tradition or whether it is in fact in some ways a union or synthesis of Kagyu and Geluk. And if you look at the title of His Holiness's book, what would you say the answer that he would give is? Synthesis, exactly. And I will say more about that question this afternoon, but for now let's just leave that question in suspension. I do want to respect your time schedules around here, but maybe if we could just let the conceptuality go for a few minutes here, and just with proper invocation of one's guru and a kind of visualization of one's guru, and seeing the guru as coming to the crown of your head and then melting into you, and feeling yourself one with the guru in terms of purification and in terms of attainment, and in particular resting in and concentrating on the clear, aware nature of your own mind. And within a concentration on the clear, aware nature of your own mind, which is space-like, investigating briefly whether this clear, aware mind exists inherently in any respect. You can seek for it within the aggregates, collectively or individually. You can look for it outside the aggregates. Wherever you look, you're not going to find an inherently existing, clear, aware mind. And from not finding that, simply rest in an open, aware state that is a similitude of the recognition of the emptiness of mind. And finally, from within this state of the recognition of the emptiness of mind and of everything else, vow nevertheless that in your life you will seek to liberate all beings, even though they have no self-existence. And that as you go through your day, you will recognize the emptiness, the illusory-like nature of whatever it is you encounter and experience. Okay, we can dedicate the merit. Which page is that? To this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their sufferings. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore.